I wish I could tell him the truth about his son before it's too late." The whispered words of Nurse Amara Johnson cut through the sterile silence of the intensive care unit like a blade, causing Khalil Al Rashid to fight every instinct to open his eyes and reveal that his coma was completely fabricated. The 52-year-old oil magnate lay motionless in the hospital bed, his breathing carefully regulated to maintain the illusion that had fooled his family, his doctors, and his business partners for 3 weeks. But the 34-year-old African-American nurse, who had been caring for him during the night shift, had just said something that made his blood run cold with implications he couldn't yet understand. For 21 days, Khalil had been pretending to be in a medically induced coma, while secretly listening to conversations that revealed the true nature of the people around him. What had started as a desperate attempt to avoid federal investigators, who were closing in on his oil company's financial crimes, had become an unexpected window into the hearts and minds of everyone who believed he couldn't hear them. His wife Layla had revealed her plans to divorce him and take half his assets the moment he died or recovered. His business partner Rahman had admitted to federal agents that Khalil was solely responsible for the money laundering scheme they had both participated in for years. His eldest daughter Noor had confessed to her mother that she was relieved her father might die because his reputation was destroying her chances at a good marriage in their social circle. His younger daughter Rana had proven even more callous, discussing with her husband how quickly they could liquidate Khalil's art collection and real estate holdings. Even his brother Omar, who had publicly supported the family during this crisis, had privately told Rahman that Khalil's downfall was probably deserved, and that the family would be better off distancing themselves from the scandal. Every conversation Khalil had overheard during his fake coma had revealed another layer of betrayal and self-interest among the people he had spent his life supporting and trusting. But this night shift nurse, who had been nothing more than a silent presence, changing his IV bags and monitoring his vital signs, had just uttered words that suggested she knew something about his family that could change everything. Khalil remained perfectly still, his breathing shallow and even, while his mind raced to understand what Amara could possibly know about his son that would matter whether he lived or died. His son Yasin was 23 years old, a graduate of Columbia University, with degrees in social work and international relations, and the only family member who had shown any genuine grief about his father's condition. Every day, for 3 weeks, Yasin had sat by his bedside for hours, reading books aloud about social justice and human rights, talking about his work at a nonprofit organization that provided services to marginalized communities, and expressing hope for his father's recovery, with a sincerity that contrasted sharply with the false concern displayed by other family members. While his wife and daughters visited for brief periods and spent most of their time on their phones discussing practical matters, Yasin brought personal items from home to make his father more comfortable, played his favorite music softly in the background, and spoke to him as if he believed his father could hear and understand every word. Amara moved quietly around the room, adjusting monitors and checking medication levels with the practiced efficiency of someone who had worked in intensive care for over a decade. But Khalil could sense a heaviness in her movements, a sadness that went beyond professional sympathy for unconscious patients. She had been his primary night nurse for 2 weeks, and while she maintained perfect professional boundaries during the day when family members were present, Khalil had noticed that she lingered longer during her night shifts, sometimes sitting quietly in the corner of his room during her breaks as if keeping him company. She returned to his bedside and spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper but clearly audible in the quiet room. "Mr. Al Rashid, I know you can't hear me, but I have to say this out loud because the guilt is eating me alive. Your son Yasin, the one who comes here every day and loves you so much, he's not who you think he is. But that's not his fault. It's because you and your family have never given him a safe space to be honest about who he really is." Khalil's heart rate monitor showed a slight increase, but he forced himself to remain motionless even as his mind reeled with confusion and fear. What could this nurse possibly know about Yasin that she felt compelled to confess to an unconscious man? Amara continued, her voice heavy with emotion that suggested this was more than simple gossip or professional concern. 3 years ago, I was working in the emergency room when your son was brought in after being beaten nearly to death. He had been attacked by a group of men who targeted him because of his sexual orientation, because he's gay, and they decided to teach him a lesson about bringing shame to Arab families. The machines monitoring Khalil's vital signs began beeping more rapidly as his blood pressure spiked. But Amara seemed to interpret this as normal fluctuation in an unconscious patient. She adjusted his IV drip and continued speaking, apparently unaware that her patient was hanging on every word. The doctor saved his life, but he made me promise never to tell anyone the real reason for the attack. He was terrified that if his family found out why he had been targeted, they would blame him for bringing dishonor to the family name rather than supporting him through his recovery. Khalil felt as though the world was tilting off its axis. His son, the child he had always been most proud of, the one who had never caused trouble or brought dishonor to the family name, had been living a secret life that Khalil had never suspected. But more than shock, he felt a crushing wave of guilt as he realized that Yasin had been suffering alone, hiding a fundamental part of his identity, because he was afraid of his father's reaction and his family's judgment. Amara's voice grew even softer, as if she were sharing the most private confidence with someone she believed would never repeat it. The reason I know all this is because the man Yasin was dating at the time, Marcus, is my younger brother. For 2 years before the attack, I watched Marcus fall in love with your son, and I watched both of them live in constant fear that their families would reject them if the truth came out. They had to meet in secret, pretend they were just friends when they were around other people, and constantly worry about being discovered by someone who might report back to their families. The revelation hit Khalil like a physical blow. His son had been navigating a romantic relationship under conditions of secrecy and fear, while Khalil remained completely oblivious to his child's emotional life. For 2 years, Yasin had been experiencing love, companionship, and happiness that he felt he had to hide from his own father. When those men attacked Yasin, Marcus was devastated, Amara continued. He blamed himself for not being there to protect him, even though the attack happened when Yasin was walking home alone from work. But you know what broke my heart the most? After Yasin recovered from his physical injuries, he told Marcus that they had to break up because he couldn't risk his father finding out and disowning him. The weight of this revelation was staggering. His son had chosen to sacrifice his own happiness and end a loving relationship, rather than risk disappointing a father who had been too proud and rigid to create a space where Yasin felt safe being honest. While Khalil had been building his business empire and worrying about social standing and family reputation, his son had been navigating dangerous situations, violent attacks, and heartbreaking choices completely alone. But Amara wasn't finished with her confession. For the past year, since he broke up with Marcus to protect your family's reputation, Yasin has been trying to force himself to be someone he's not. He's been dating women, accepting blind dates that your wife arranges, and trying to convince himself and everyone else that he can live the heterosexual life you want him to live. But it's destroying him from the inside. My brother Marcus sees him sometimes around the city, and he says Yasin looks like a ghost of himself. Khalil's mind raced as he processed this information. He thought about the recent changes he had noticed in his son, the weight loss, the increased dedication to work that seemed more like escape than passion, the polite but distant way Yasin had responded to family suggestions about marriage and dating. He had attributed these changes to stress from completing his graduate studies and starting his career, never imagining that his son was struggling with something far more fundamental and painful. The non-profit organization where Yasin worked focused on providing support services to marginalized communities, including LGBTQ youth who had been rejected by their families. He had always been proud of his son's humanitarian work, thinking it reflected well on the family's values and their commitment to social responsibility. Now, he realized that Yasin had probably chosen that work because he understood firsthand what it felt like to be rejected and alone, because he was living in daily fear of experiencing that rejection from his own family. Amara checked his pulse and adjusted his pillow, her touch gentle and professional, despite the emotional weight of her words. The worst part is that Yasin still loves you so much that he's willing to destroy his own happiness to maintain your approval. Every day when he sits here reading to you and talking about his life, he's performing a version of himself that he thinks you want to see. He's never going to tell you the truth about who he really is, because he'd rather live a lie than risk losing your love. And the tragedy is that he's already losing himself in the process. The irony was devastating and complex. Khalil had been faking a coma to avoid the consequences of his financial crimes, while his son had been faking his entire identity to avoid the consequences of family rejection. Both father and son had been living lies, but Yasin's deception was motivated by love and fear of abandonment, while Khalil's was motivated by cowardice and self-preservation. The man lying unconscious to escape federal prosecutors was discovering that his son had been living unconsciously to escape paternal disappointment. Amara moved toward the door but paused and turned back toward his bed. I probably shouldn't be telling you any of this, and I know you can't hear me anyway, but I had to say it out loud. If you could somehow wake up and have a second chance with your son, I hope you would tell him that love is more important than reputation, that his happiness matters more than what other people think, and that being honest about who you are takes more courage than living up to anyone else's expectations. I see families destroyed by secrets and pride all the time in this hospital, and I can't bear to watch another one fall apart when there's still time to save it. After Amara left the room, Khalil lay in the darkness, processing everything he had learned about his son and about himself as a father. The child he loved most in the world had been suffering in silence, while Khalil pursued money and status that now seemed not only meaningless but actively harmful to his family's well-being. The federal investigation that had driven him to fake his coma suddenly felt like a minor inconvenience compared to the realization that he had created a family environment where his son felt unsafe being authentic. For hours, Khalil wrestled with the implications of Amara's revelation. He thought about all the conversations he had had with Yasin over the years, looking for signs he had missed or misinterpreted. He remembered Yasin's lack of enthusiasm when discussing potential marriages arranged by family members, his tendency to change the subject when relatives asked about girlfriends, and his passionate advocacy for human rights, causes that Khalil had attributed to youthful idealism rather than personal experience with discrimination and marginalization. He recalled family gatherings where cousins and uncles had made disparaging comments about LGBTQ individuals, comments that Khalil had either ignored or tacitly supported as part of maintaining traditional family values. Now he realized that his son had been sitting silently through those conversations, hearing his own identity attacked and rejected by the people who were supposed to love and support him unconditionally. But what tormented Khalil most was the knowledge that his son was sacrificing his own happiness and authentic relationships out of love for a father who had been too self-absorbed and status-conscious to notice his child's pain. While Khalil had been worrying about business deals, social standing, and maintaining the family's reputation in their conservative community, Yasin had been navigating violence, heartbreak, and the terrible choice between authenticity and family acceptance. The next morning, when Yasin arrived for his daily visit, Khalil listened with new understanding as his son read from a book about social justice and talked about his work helping marginalized youth find housing and support services. Every word carried new meaning now that Khalil understood the personal experience behind his son's professional choices. When Yasin mentioned a particularly difficult case involving a young man who had been disowned by his family for being gay, Khalil heard the pain in his son's voice and realized he was probably talking about his own fears and experiences. As Yasin described the nonprofit's efforts to provide safe housing for LGBTQ youth who had been rejected by their families, Khalil began to understand that his son wasn't just doing charitable work, he was dedicating his life to preventing other young people from experiencing the isolation and fear that he lived with every day. The passion in Yasin's voice when he talked about helping marginalized communities wasn't abstract compassion. It was the dedication of someone who understood personally what it meant to be rejected and alone. For 3 more days, Khalil maintained his deception while observing his son with new eyes and listening to his words with new understanding. He noticed the careful way Yasin chose his words when talking about his personal life, never quite lying but never telling the whole truth either. He saw the sadness that flickered across his son's face when he thought his father wasn't watching, and the weight of pretense that seemed to exhaust him even during these one-sided conversations with an apparently unconscious man. Khalil also began to notice details about his son's appearance and behavior that he had previously overlooked or misinterpreted. The weight loss that he had attributed to work stress was more severe than he had realized, and Yasin's clothes hung loosely on his frame in a way that suggested poor appetite and self-neglect, His son's eyes, which had always been bright and expressive, now showed a dullness that spoke of chronic emotional pain and exhaustion from maintaining a false persona. But it was Amara's return to his night shift that finally convinced Khalil that he couldn't continue his charade. As she performed her routine care, checking his vital signs and adjusting his medications, she spoke to him again in the quiet darkness. "I've been thinking about what I told you the other night, and I realize I was being selfish, using you as a confessor, because I couldn't talk to anyone else about how worried I am about both Yasin and my brother Marcus. They're both good men who deserve to be happy, but they're trapped by fear of rejection and social judgment." She paused in her work and looked directly at his face, as if searching for some sign of consciousness behind his closed eyelids. "I keep hoping that somehow you can hear me, and that if you ever wake up you'll remember what I've told you. Because Yasin needs his father to love him unconditionally, not just the version of himself that he thinks you want to see. And Marcus needs to know that love is worth fighting for, even when it's complicated and difficult, and requires standing up to family expectations." Amara continued, her voice growing more emotional, as she spoke about the impact of family rejection on both young men. "Marcus has been struggling too, wondering if he should have fought harder for their relationship, instead of accepting Yasin's decision to break up. He blames himself for not being strong enough to challenge the social pressures that force them apart. Both of them are living half-lives now, going through the motions of dating other people but never really connecting with anyone because they're still in love with each other." That night, Khalil made a decision that would change everything. He had been hiding from federal investigators and family disappointment, but his son had been hiding from something far more fundamental: the fear of losing his father's love for being authentic. If Khalil could find the courage to face the legal consequences of his financial crimes, surely he could find the courage to face the social consequences of loving his son unconditionally. The next morning, when Yasin arrived for his visit, carrying a new book about international human rights law, Khalil slowly opened his eyes for the first time in 24 days. His son's gasp of surprise and joy was immediately followed by calls for doctors and nurses, but Khalil reached out and grasped Yasin's hand before anyone else could enter the room. "Son," he whispered, his voice hoarse from weeks of silence, "there's something I need to tell you before the doctors come. I know about Marcus. I know about the attack. I know about everything you've been hiding, and I need you to understand that none of it changes how much I love you or how proud I am of the man you've become." Yasin's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, fear, confusion, and finally a desperate hope that he seemed afraid to trust. "Dad, I don't understand. How could you know about any of that? You've been unconscious for weeks. The doctors said you couldn't hear or process anything that was happening around you." Khalil squeezed his son's hand and made a decision to be completely honest, regardless of the consequences. "I haven't been unconscious at all. I've been faking the coma to avoid federal investigators who are building a case against my company for money laundering. But that doesn't matter now. What matters is that I've spent weeks listening to people talk, and I've realized that I've been the worst kind of father, the kind who makes his child afraid to be honest about who they really are." The shock on Yasin's face was profound, but Khalil continued before his son could respond. "A nurse named Amara told me about your relationship with her brother, about the attack you survived, about how you've been sacrificing your happiness to protect my reputation and our family's standing in the community. And I need you to know that you are more important to me than any reputation, any business deal, any social standing. I would rather have an honest son who is happy being himself than a pretend son who is destroying himself to meet my expectations." Yasin began to cry. 23 years of fear and pretense finally releasing in the safety of his father's unconditional acceptance. "Dad, I was so scared you would hate me if you knew the truth about who I really am. I've been trying so hard to be the son you wanted that I forgot who I actually was. I've been so lonely and afraid, and I didn't know how to tell you without losing everything that matters to me." Khalil pulled his son closer, his own tears falling freely for the first time in decades. "You are exactly the son I want, brave enough to help other people who are struggling with the same issues you face, honest enough to sacrifice your own happiness for family, strong enough to survive violence and heartbreak, and still choose to dedicate your life to helping others. I'm the one who needs to change, not you. I need to become the kind of father who creates safety instead of fear, acceptance instead of judgment. When the doctors arrived to examine Khalil and confirm his recovery, they were amazed by what appeared to be a complete restoration of his cognitive and physical abilities after weeks of unresponsiveness. But they couldn't have imagined that his real recovery had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with a nurse's compassionate confession that had opened his eyes to what truly mattered in life. Before we wrap this story up, I'd like to thank you for reaching this far. And if you enjoyed this story as much as I think you did, then be sure to show your support by liking and subscribing so this channel. Now back to the story. Over the following weeks, as Khalil faced the legal consequences of his financial crimes and prepared for a probable prison sentence, he used his remaining freedom to rebuild his relationship with his son based on truth rather than pretense. He met Marcus, apologized for the pain his family's expectations had caused, both young men, and gave his blessing to their relationship with the same enthusiasm he had once reserved for business deals and social advancement. The oil empire that had once defined Khalil's identity was dismantled by federal authorities, his assets frozen, and his reputation destroyed in the business community that had once revered him. But he discovered that watching his son reclaim his authentic life and happiness provided a satisfaction that no business success had ever matched. Yasin and Marcus were able to rebuild their relationship slowly and carefully, with the support of both their families for the first time. Amara Johnson, the night shift nurse whose confession had changed everything, received an unexpected visit from both Khalil and Yasin, thanking her for the courage to speak truth to someone she thought couldn't hear her. Her compassion and willingness to advocate for her patient son had not only saved a family, but had taught a father that love required courage, acceptance required strength, and that the most important conversations often happen when we think no one is listening. Khalil Al Rashid learned that the most valuable thing he had ever owned was his son's trust and love, and that preserving those required the courage to value people over reputation, authenticity over appearance, and love over social expectations. His fake coma had been meant to help him escape consequences, but it had instead taught him that sometimes the people we overlook the most are exactly the ones with the wisdom we need to hear.